Welcome back to the Context Coaching Podcast. We are joined today by Jamie O'Loughlin, who is the head basketball coach at Western Australia Institute of Sports wheelchair team, and he is the head coach of the Western Australia U20 national team, state team. He's going to clarify that for me in a minute. But most importantly, he's just an all-around basketball junkie. Coach, thanks for calling in today from down under. Hopefully the connection works on the audio and we get a great sound bite here.
Thanks, Justin. Pleasure to be joining this morning, and my favorite topic, discussing basketball. So keen to get into it.
Let's dive in here. And so traditionally we want to set the table with a little grounding question of how did we get to where we are today, Coach, right? What was the process for you getting into coaching to begin with, landing your first job, subsequent jobs? What's been that path along the way so that the audience knows who we're dealing with?
Yeah, it's been a fairly long one, so I'll try to keep it as tight as I possibly can. So I'm getting on now, but it began purely being involved in my local club. I was playing and getting to the age where my parents were expecting me to pay for things myself, and it came time to pay the club fees for my next basketball season. And the club were really good in that they would basically waive your club fees if you coached one of their junior teams. So I thought that sounds okay. I'm sure I could help out somewhere. And so they gave me the under 16 girls team who no one wanted to coach because they'd been playing for 2 years, hadn't won a game. They were down to 6 players, and it was like, we got this guy, have a crack. And that was the beginning. And to be honest, it actually inspired me to then want to coach, because I hadn't thought about coaching prior to that. But just those little moments that came along during that season where I could just see I brought joy to the athletes. And that was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm finding that really fun when they have little wins. And so that kind of hooked me. Then it was probably only maybe a year or so later, there was a chance to work in basketball as a basketball development officer with an association. So I picked that job up. That was a part-time job working in schools and developing junior programs within the local association. And that then expanded into coaching representative teams of that association. So then I started head coaching some under 12 and under 14 teams in our state league in Victoria. Did that for a while, moved to the UK and was living over there, got involved in basketball again in a development role with a club who were expanding into National League. So I ended up coaching their under 17 and under 19 teams in that competition for a couple of years. Back to Australia after that. Pretty much when I arrived, a coaching buddy asked me if I could help him out by coaching one of their teams, again back in the junior representative sort of space in the state league. So I was an under 12 boys team, started doing that, did that for about the next 8 years, bouncing around between under 12 to under 18, and also started to then get involved in the state programs. So that's that next level up in their development programs. That led into then assistant coaching and then head coaching state teams at our junior national championships at under 16, under 18, under 20 over about a decade. And while that was all happening, I picked up a job at a K-12 school in Geelong, where they'd had a basketball program initially when the school first started, and then got quite big, and then it dropped away, and it had fallen away to just 2 or 3 teams. They wanted to build it back up, and so they offered me a job there to do that. So I ended up working for them for 15 years while I was doing my other coaching. And yeah, that's working with grassroots basically, and building kids up, getting them when they're 5 or 6 years of age at school and going from there. And they integrated me into their bigger sports program. So I ended up not just coaching basketball, but I'd be involved in the entire sport program as one of the staff. So that was great. And then a chance to coach in the semi-pro league in Geelong came up. So I started doing that as an assistant first of all, and then took over as a head coach. And that was in Geelong. And then I moved into the pros. So then spent the next period in the pros. So I went to WA, coached with the Wildcats, went to Queensland and coached with the Cairns Taipans as assistant coach in both places. So it was about an 8-year journey. So then I'd obviously backed off all those other things to fit that in. coinciding with sort of that semi-pro time, I was involved in junior national teams. So I did 2 world championships with under 17 boys and 2 world university games, which was basically that stage the Boomers underpinning program. So many of the players that are in that have been in that program on the way up. And then more recently, moved back to WA with this young family now. So I've reconfigured things a little bit to balance it out. Had a player and a coach development role at local association. It's now moved on from that into the West Australian Institute of Sport, which has been my first time with wheelchair basketball. 30 years after it all started, now I was finally getting into wheelchair basketball, and then have just picked up the under 20 job with the WA team for the 2025 national championships. So that's actually a snapshot because it's been over so many years.
That's awesome. It's super helpful because it takes me to where I wanted to end up, and we will try to keep this brief. For those of you that aren't aware, I spent 2 weeks in Australia over the summer, about 4 days in WA, which is Western Australia, and then 4 days in Melbourne, and then 6 days in Sydney. And I visited coach at the Western Australia Institute of Sport, watched him conduct practice. And what I learned about the Australian system of basketball development and sport development was quite fascinating in contrast to what we do. So if you don't mind, coach, give like 10,000-foot high level view, painting a picture for a kindergarten, like how do sports work in Australia? Because you mentioned state association, rep teams, you mentioned state program, you mentioned K through 12 school and local clubs, but without getting in the weeds, it took me 2 weeks to figure it out. But can you give like a soundbite for people that are listening?
Yeah, absolutely. Our sport, and no matter which it is, basketball is really no different to the rest, is heavily based in the club space. So while schools provide sport to various levels, but it is involved in all schools, it's clubs that are the bedrock. So whatever sport it is, there'll be that extracurricular sport that people can be involved in before or after school or on weekends in their chosen sport. They are also the breeding ground for the program, the pathway programs. Almost exclusively, that projection of next level of athlete comes out of that into your club basketball, then goes into, which is your local stuff. Then you can compete in your entire state. So your clubs within your state will compete for a state championship. If you're lucky enough to be then selected to represent your state, then you can get a chance to compete at a national stage. So that's tournament-based play now. We've gone from club play, which is league play, state play, which is league play, but then national play is tournament-based. And then, of course, you can graduate to your national team program, which again is all tournament-based. Obviously, we've then added in things like going into college. So athletes heading to the US predominantly to bridge the gap between amateur and pro, and then our semi-pro leagues, which are now probably offering quite a high standard.
Beautiful. Thank you. And the other thing that was I don't want to call it a wild takeaway, but it's definitely different than being in the States where you at your age and my age can still be competing in basketball should you want to, which doesn't necessarily exist here other than like casual adult leagues. There's like clubs that you're still playing, not you particularly, but you can still play in as an adult in Australia, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that keeps a lot of people in the sport. There's many tiers of senior basketball at state level competition. I think in Victoria, they may go down to a 5th tier. So there may be 15 to 20 teams at each tier of that. You could be playing in the, I don't know, the 100th best men's team in Victoria and still be playing at a fairly competitive level.
No doubt. Okay, I have one more question before we get into your approach personally. So one of my major takeaways was that the school level that you mentioned, the K through 12, we were down to 3 teams, which is okay. That's a traditional high school here in the States. But when I was visiting schools in WA and in Sydney and in Melbourne, it was very much, we have 60 teams at the school. And I'm like, what? How do you serve all those teams? How do you practice? How do you train? And my takeaway was basically both the clubs and the school-based athletics are basically 2-day-a-week training with some weekend set pieces as their standard model compared to the 5 to 6 day a week approach in schools in the States. Can you talk a little bit about how that model serves, even though it's not necessarily as much as we're doing? It's not like the Aussies are falling behind and we're making this huge jump over here, but just conceptually, like why that model versus the daily approach?
Yeah. Look, I think that the thing with the clubs is obviously it allows for choice within the school. Their role then just tends to be, look, just give the kids a snapshot of what different sports are. We're just trying to light a little bit of a fire, and then we want to point them in the direction of clubs that which can facilitate that next step for them. So the schools don't really invest usually too much into time into anything other than just that initial experience. So they're trying to give a really broad range. How that probably helps is then if you are really interested, then the clubs are the right place for you now because you want to spend a couple of days a week. But for the most part, again, that demand on the athlete isn't that big. So what it allows them to do is play multiple sports in specialist environments. So you may become very skilled now over the summer in basketball and swimming. And then in the winter, it might be athletics and football because there's time to fit a second or a third sport in there because it's not too encompassing. I guess the challenge comes for our high performance athletes in balancing them when they have multiple tiers of their one sport that are asking for their time.
For those of you that are listening, athletics in Australian translates to track and field. It took me a while to figure that one out. Okay, coach, let's pivot back to you personally. So, the long resume of head jobs and assistant jobs and your evolution over time. If you could think back to the beginning when you first pivoted from being an assistant or not even coaching to being a lead coach, what are some of the things you realized right away you had to figure out, even though you had a background that prepared you for it? But when you move over 18 inches, it's a different job.
Yeah. I guess the first thing is, if I go back to that very first experience, is what the hell is a coach do? I'm 18. They're 15-year-old girls. As I said, they hadn't had much experience or success. And myself as a player, I'm a product of our system, as I just explained. My interest was in cricket, was in football, was in basketball, was in track. There was a whole range of things going on for me, and I hadn't really overly specialized and spent too much time in any one space. So it really was, okay, what does a coach do? What is it that I can bring to these athletes? So that was my first challenge that I had. And then probably the first learning that I had, which was something that I still today, it is still somewhat of a challenge, is dealing with hard conversations. And that was, again, something that came up fairly early in the process because you've got parents involved. That hard conversation could be with a parent, or it could be with a representative of the club, or it could be with one of your athletes. And it came up early. It continues to come up to this very day. And yeah, that's probably something that if I look back, if perhaps I had have been challenged around hard conversations prior to it, would have helped me in the early stages. But again, that was my journey.
So, as a veteran coach, how have you built systems or strategies, or how has your approach evolved so that those difficult conversations are less frequent, right? Meaning you have now put pieces in place from a communication, from an efficiency standpoint, from a role definition standpoint, right? What are some of these things you've learned over time that reduces the frequency of the difficult conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Having some clarity around what's your role, what's my role. If I even pair it back to one of the things I didn't talk about, but to my experience this year of coaching my son's under 8 basketball team, is around what's my role as the coach? What is the role of the player? What is the role of the parent? What is the role of the team manager? And because everyone's extremely excited and at that point and wants to chip in, but they maybe don't really understand the key role they play. So just trying to have some clarity initially with around what role do we play. I tend to do that more so as discussion and collaboration rather than me telling them this is what it is. because there can be some lines that are a bit blurry. And so it's good to actually talk about those things and just clean those things up. And also in some cases, there can be roles where I was expecting to pick up that element, but we've actually got that skill within the group somewhere, and I don't need to actually tend to it. I can just charge that responsibility to somebody else. So collaboration and clarity at the beginning, which allows me, when something does come up, I can refer back to what we did at the very beginning.
What have you found with, say, I know you're just getting into this U18 group coming up, or is it the U20s? Whatever it is, but you've coached that age group, right? The 16s, the 18s, the 20s, where you have some more established athletes. You definitely have some more established egos in regards to specific tools you've used to help set those conversations up. So, for example, one of the things that I do every year with my team is I sit all the athletes down. It's okay. Here's a list of players. Write down how many minutes each of these players should be playing and then add them up. And inevitably, it's 50% more minutes than are available, right? And you whittle it down, and they're like, ultimately, coach, everybody can't play them. It's correct. So what are some tools that you've used to help grease the wheels for those conversations?
Yeah. And look, at the very early stages, I've done a similar thing where, to be honest, we had 8 players in the team, and I put all 8 on the court to start a game of basketball. And then the ref turned around and said, "Coach, you can only add 5." And I said, "Sorry, guys." So to get
So
3 of the
good.
kids off,
That's so good.
it was fun, and they got the point. And all of a sudden, we could talk about it rather than sort of them having their back up as well. It's the rules. So no, look, to be honest, and I guess in preparation even for this 20s program, which is about to start, so we're already in the planning phase of how we're gonna do this. And I guess right from the get-go is us discussing some key things around how we might even choose who's going to be in the group and having some clarity around that. And this starts to form roles within the team. For example, a big discussion point will be in our trial is that what I'm looking for is moments where your character emerges. And so we'll be putting some activities in place where I know I'm probably fishing for certain things, and they'll come out. And that starts to form our idea around what kind of a role could this player play if they were selected in this team. The second piece being, what do they do well? What do they bring to the table? And how does that relate to this cohort? Yeah, coach, I'm a really good shooter. You may be a good shooter. If we look at the data and we watch the vision back of the trial, you may be at club level. But when you're in this cohort, you have defaulted into the average shooter bracket. That now comes down to part of the evaluation about what opportunity may or may not be there for you. It's the combination of character traits that jump out, the strengths that jump out, and how they relate to the current, because you do get into that conversation of, well, my son scores 20 points a game in his local team. And while that may be true, if we then look at the standard of competition, for example, or the maturity of the athletes, yet your son is an early maturer and is doing it in a physical way, and when that balances out to play at the next level, it's just not going to be that easy. So we have to factor that in. It just informs us as to what the role can be. So it's discussing those things and having some evidence to then to come back to the player. Discover, as I said, character or strength based in our evaluation.
I love that. And if you could do me a solid, you said I have some activities that will flush out character things I'm looking for. Give an example of what one of those activities might be.
Yeah, and we're designing them right now as our coaching staff. For example, and again, I'll give the athletes a clue as to what's happening, but I'm not going to give them the full story. But I actually want to see how they respond to very difficult situations, challenging situations, ones where they even feel like it's unjust. And how do they respond? It could be simple, as we've discussed, ones where we officiate the game and we clearly just make bad calls, very basic level.
Yep.
Another one may be which I'm exploring a bit for this one, is we are going to make it clear we're going to chart wins and losses. So we might play some 3-on-3 games. So if fails, we have 3-on-3. Here's some basic stuff. But at any moment in time, a coach may be able to impact the group. So I might say, if I call an athlete's name, they need to come and tag my hand, right? So they have to leave the playing environment for a moment, come tag and get back in. Now, all of a sudden, this feels pretty unfair because I've just told you I'm going to chart wins and losses, and that's going to be part of our evaluation. And now I'm just putting you at a serious disadvantage at random moments. So just trying to come up with different ways. And again, that's one I haven't trialed yet, but I certainly have trialed the bad call scenario. So as ways to try to see what happens, what do they do? How do they talk to each other? How do they help each other, etc. But there's other stuff where I'm not going to do anything other than observe their behavior off the court. For instance, somebody's left their drink bottles on the bench down the end. It's 5 meters away when we've come in. There's a kid walking right by it. What does he do?
Absolutely. No, I love that. And the bad call piece is something that I think we've all probably worked in intentionally, trying to teach kids that are athletes in general. Hey, life's not fair. How are you going to respond? I love the other one that you mentioned, right? You're in the middle of something. It's, hey, you got to get a 5, like the disadvantage transition game, but built into 3-on-3 as well.
Yep.
Love that. Okay. Let me ask question that I want to get to later, but I just want to dive in right now. How has coaching wheelchair or parasport informed your development as a coach as you move back to able-bodied teams?
Wheelchair, look, it's been a really interesting experience, and I'm so glad that I've adopted this mindset all through my coaching journey, is just to have a go. And just from that first team, as I spoke about before, just I haven't coached before, but I'll just try and work it out. Same thing here. And I guess I put on the table to the Institute, look, I'd love to have a crack at it, but if in 3 months' time, if I'm not enjoying it, or you don't feel like I'm fulfilling what you need, then we can move on. So we're sort of 12 months into that now and really enjoying it. But the first thing was, there was things that I was concerned about that I didn't need to be concerned about. End of the day, whether it's wheelchair basketball, it's underage basketball, it's senior basketball, we're dealing with humans, right? And trying to understand who it is that's in front of you, and then how does that inform you as to how you proceed? And I'm not talking about who is in front of you in terms of basketball skill or sports specific skill, just the person that's in front of you. And that very quickly helps. So that just continues to reinforce. I guess the other thing that's been quite timely is that I've been given open slather as to how I want to go about working with the wheelchair athletes. So rather than being told this is how you need to do it, it was like, look, we actually want to get somebody to come in with perhaps a different history, perspective, and try some stuff. It's coincided with sort of me diving a little bit into some different ways in regard to learning, and how I can extend on my understanding of how people learn. So we've worked very much at using the base out of ecological dynamics, using the constraints-led approach, incorporating that into what we do, which has been an interesting journey with the athletes, and we've had some great success. So basically challenging theory around learning and challenging theory around preconceived ideas about what people are and are not capable of doing. So in the wheelchair space, it felt like going back to maybe the 1980s or earlier in able-bodied basketball. I felt at times I looked at it and felt I was watching the 1960 Boston Celtics play in the style that they were trying to play. And very constrained space, very precise movement of the ball because of the space. So very skilled. And the challenge was to say, is there another way? The second piece being that positions are still very strongly defined in wheelchair basketball. And so challenging and saying, does it have to be that way? And how do you know that's true, that athlete can only do those things? Because their position is defined by an arbitrary body who decide what point evaluation goes to a player. They say you're a 1-point player or you're a 4.5 player. So a 1-pointer being fairly restricted in their movement versus a 4.5-point player, that's how many points awarded to you, being someone who's pretty free in their movement, right? So all of a sudden saying, okay, the 1-pointer, you can only do this and this. So for me, that was centers. You can just run to the rim and rebound and protect the rim, and that's your job, and don't even dare do anything else. So all of a sudden saying, does it have to be that way? So I guess it continues to challenge, it continues to inspire me to challenge those kinds of ideas and say, rather than, okay, this player's small, he's a point guard. I'm simplifying this as much as I can to say that's not really that important right now. I need to see what you can do, and we need to explore what's capable for you. And then that tied back into the learning. Okay, how am I going to go about the athletes learning what they can and can't do? How do we challenge that?
So on that, one of the things that I was able to take away just by being in that training session for an hour with you, one, obviously you're doing some constraints based things, which I want to get to in a second. I'm going to ask that question. But what I noticed was how the constraint of being in the wheelchair actually made them much more efficient in transition decision making, because while they could put the ball in their lap and wheel, they could then peek and see the floor and then pick it up and make a play. And I'm sitting there going, okay, how can I bring this concept back or transfer it to a traditional game where we pound the ball into the ground, or we're not looking ahead and advancing the ball or surveying the court, right? So I was like, whoa, imagine what you could teach. And obviously we can't bring a bunch of wheelchairs in, but the concept of, whoa, hold the ball and peek for a second, but don't stop moving and survey, right? So that was my takeaway. So with that, what are some of these constraints that you've built in, not just in that role, but in your other coaching role, right? So with your U8 team, with your U20 team, talk a little bit about some of the constraints you've found to be the most efficient in teaching a particular skill.
Mm. It's all relevant to the group you've got in front, right? And this is the bit that really interests me, and it is probably one of the biggest challenges that sits in front of coaching going forward. Is there's never going to be a book that you can go to, for instance, where you can go, all right, I need to work on shooting, and go to the shooting page and go, these are the constraints that we'll put in this order, in this way, for this to happen. Whereas you could go back to coaching manuals and easily see it laid out step, you do this, and then you do this, and this is how you become a great shooter. Unfortunately, that's how you become the best shooter you can be at that one technique. And unfortunately, that's not how the game's played. There's multiple techniques used even by the same player within the same game, within even the same quarter, or even back-to-back possessions. It really says, that really isn't an efficient way of learning straight away. It's going to be an answer without giving you the straight answer, because you have to know who's in front of you at that time and what is the appropriate constraint. So the biggest challenge I'm finding is, in a team environment, how do I set multiple levels of constraint in one activity? Because I've got 10, let's say 10 athletes in front of me. There may only be, I might be able to group some of them and say, look, this fits there. And then others I have to find. So that's my thing at the moment, is narrowing down on multiple constraints that I can put in. So individual constraints, and then marrying that up against the group constraint, because I can't have too much either. And it gets, if I over constrain, then it's not going to work out well for the athletes. They're not really going to learn. That's the balance. That's what I'm loving digging into and trialing and winning and losing that battle. But for me, that's a big one right now.
No, that's perfect, because the answer to any question that we ask in any facet of life is it depends, right? But
Yes.
in this particular case, when you say I've got 10 athletes in front of me, I have to build maybe 10 different constraints in individually within the team constraint. Just give a quick example of what a constraint even is, because hell, for 15 years, I probably didn't hear that term. And now it's been popularized in the approach to teaching versus what you mentioned in the coaching manuals of like step 1, step 2, step 3, right?
Yep. Yeah, we've looked a lot at shooting, and I guess the first, and spacing. So, looking at how do we manipulate the game. So whether it's 3-on-3 or whatever we might use, we do use a lot of 3-on-3, but it could be any different description. But spacing around, as I said to you, wheelchair, very constrained. The mindset is to be very constrained, tending then to settle for what are actually low percentage shots in the grand scheme of things, but they've become probably as good as you can be at a bad shot. And then therefore justifying that this is okay. And I'm like, but it could be better. So how are we going to do this? And so looking at things like, you can't sit still in a certain space. So we wanted to exaggerate it early on and say that anything basically within a meter of the charge circle is our gold area. Anything outside the 3-point line is silver, and everything in between is bronze. There's some value to the bronze, but the ultimate goal is a gold. But a silver can offer, because there's an extra point on value for that shot. So basic analytics and discussing with the athletes, then how do we use that? So some constraints have been things like you can't pass to someone in the bronze area. Another constraint, you can't be stationary in the bronze area. So we're just looking at different ways of, and that's it. The rest of the game then remains the same, but we've just placed that one constraint, which is a big one, because it was challenging the very heart of the way that they would structure how to score. So that's certainly been one. Changing value of shots, which we've mixed with some different things, but even to the point of trying to encourage the bulk of athletes who haven't experienced shooting from 3-point range. We want to actually just tap into, we just want you to explore. So if you can hit the rim, we'll reward you with a point. So this has been an important one of recent time, because I would say 80% of our athletes in our institute or even in our national program are not proficient 3-point shooters, but we want to leverage the space. And they may never be super proficient 3-point shooters, but we do need the space. And so we'll have multiple ways of using the space. But first of all, it's just giving them some belief that they can contribute from that range. So what we've also found is, and I don't have a number on this yet, Justin, but I'd love to have a better metric. But coach's eye tells us we offensive rebound at a higher rate from a missed three than we do a missed mid-range shot. Again, an incentive. If you just hit the rim, then we'll go get it and we'll get ourselves another shot. And it often actually leads to a shot closer to the rim. So we're trying to fill them with confidence to explore.
Such an interesting take, because most of us, me included, I don't want my kids shooting 3-point shots that can't make them. It's just a turnover. But thinking about it from that perspective is, okay, interesting. I'll have to put that to, as you say, I'll have to trial that a little bit as we get into the season here coming up. Let me pivot.
Well, I guess, sorry, Justin, not to cut you off, but that really then challenges the idea around what is our role with these athletes at this point of their journey. So we can say, I don't really want my athletes taking threes because it's effectively a turnover. But if we're saying, but hang on, my job is not to be the world under 12 champion right now. My job is to keep these kids engaged and enjoying the sport so they stay in the sport for as long as possible. So as many continue to play for as long as possible. And then some of those will go on. And some of the experiences that I give them now, where the punishment for that missed shot now is very different to the one later. If I don't facilitate the growth of this player in expanding their skills to their optimum level now, the time they actually will find, where who cares? Oh yeah, okay, play to win, but who cares? Versus now they want to make their state team, for example. Oh, we'll go to Australia. I won't try to navigate the US system. But
no, that works.
People
that listen understand that. You're trying out for a team that's a little bit better, and you got to have confidence and or a marketable skill.
Yeah. And they're like, the kid can't shoot.
Yeah.
He hasn't been allowed to even explore shooting, and he's 15.
Yeah. No, and I hear you, and I don't disagree with that. And it's the age-old question, okay, at what point do you put the constraints on and define clear roles? Because, right, in your state system or your rep system, right, at that level, you're not exploring anymore at the U18 level, right? You have a clearly defined role. You have something you've been asked to do versus your U8 team, like jack them up, right? My middle school girls team, get them up. I don't care. But once we get to the high school, it's star in the role you have and train for the one you want, right? And I'm going to carve that role out purposefully so that you can be great at that in this moment, right? And you actually give me your take on this. I will line my kids up on the baseline and tell them, you're a driver, you're a shooter, you're a combo player, you're a ball changer. Coach, what's a ball changer? That means you get it and you pass it to someone else, right? And then it's, hey, every shot that he takes is a pass to you. Go get it. And creating at the varsity, what would be your 18U level, very specific areas where kids can thrive rather than being mediocre. And there are many people in our world, us included at some point, that would say you are inhibiting their growth. And I'm like, no, I'm actually helping them thrive in what they're able to do right now. Give me your thoughts on that.
I think what's really important with this is that they are part of that thing about I'm a driver, for example, rather than me tell an athlete that's what I think they are best at. We're gonna find evidence around that, and we'll have that discussion. What do you bring to the table? What can you add? You can offer it to me. We can sit down and watch film. We can pull the data. We can find our different ways, whatever they may be, whatever we've got at our disposal, to have that discussion around, yeah, this is something that you are really good at. So this can be an opportunity for you to get on the floor and contribute to your team. How does that then tie into your teammates? So again, awareness of, if I bring elite cutting or dry catch and rip ability when I get the ball, how does that relate to everybody else, and how am I going to facilitate that? So them understanding those pieces. So I think them owning that piece, that they're part of that build, rather than being told this is what you are, I think we're unearthing it with them, which I think is a very important point into that. Then the next bit is, what's the stretch? What is it? Where can we just try to stretch you now as the athlete? Because ultimately, and I'll talk about this with our wheelchair athletes right now, is we are, as you said, preparing to be the player we want to be down the track. And there'll be at times full exploration in the training environment or lower level competition environment. And then there'll be somewhat where they will apply the constraint themselves, and they won't necessarily explore that shooting the way that we have been, because they're overlaying the need for high conversion at that point. But they might have another point where they're very conscious of they need to push the boundary on, and they need to explore in this space. Perhaps that's facilitating a little bit more. So they're great at slashing to the rim. They're great at driving to the rim. But now the next piece is, how do I use that to actually help others to score? Because I've been using it for myself to be a scorer, but now I've got to find ways. So what is that? And that's my stretch point right now. So I'm taking a strength and evolving into a new space.
No, I like that. That's great. Thank you for pushing back on that, because you get to the same place, but you are co-designing it with the athlete, so to speak, rather than them feeling put in a box, even if they end up in the same box, which I love.
Yeah.
Oh, all right, let me ask this. When I was there, you had a whiteboard that wasn't just for X's and O's. You had everybody's names on it, and I forget what you had tasked them with, but it had to do something with a focal point of the day and how they would grade themselves on said item, which I liken to, okay, this is a piece of culture building, let's call it, right? Where this is having a ripple effect on all the other things that you do. So do me a favor, explain that piece, but then also share what you think may be the best thing that you do in your program that is going to go with you from the U8 to the wheelchair group to this U20 group that has the largest ripple effect on what you do and how you build a team and culture.
Look, and they're definitely linked. So I think that the thing that for me is around that take from one program to the other, and how I impact on that, is that I need to model the behaviors that I want to see from the other athletes. And if I'm not doing that, then how can I expect that of them? And if I now talk about, if I link it into what you're referring to, which is, yeah, our whiteboard that we have at training is extremely rarely used for X's and O's. There may be some bits and pieces in there at times, but we have other ways of doing that. It was born out of trying to evolve the athletes into maximizing their training time. So just becoming a little more purposeful about what they do, and not just that, but how are they going to do it? And then that linking into, how does that relate to everybody else? And how could I perhaps help somebody else to be better at what they want? So we talk about it as their intentions, and there are links to their individual athlete plan that they have as well, which was also an interesting topic, because as I said to them, if Your intentions that you put on this whiteboard, which we now do once a week, if they don't line up to your IAPP, your individual athlete performance plan, then one of the two has to change. So again, we found that early on. So the athletes were saying that they wanted to work on this and this. And then I'd say, hang on, your plan says this and this. And what we got to the bottom was that the athlete plan was largely driven by the coach that sat there with them, which was their idea of what to get better. And the athlete really wanted to do something else. So they didn't have autonomy. And this is a problem. We wanted to build that in. So they put an intention on the whiteboard at the start of the week. We train 4 times a week with this group at anywhere between 1 and 3 times during the week. At the end of the session, they need to evaluate themselves on that intention. Again, they have complete autonomy around what it is. It's there for everyone else to see. Even if they want to have the same intention next week as this week, they have to rewrite it up on the board. There's a bit of method to that madness in there, but they're basically recommitting to this is what it is. Sometimes what you find is it evolves. They take the intention and they've learnt from the first week and they've now actually become more specific about what that intention really is. Now, we frame it as a measurement of intention. So our goal is to bring attention to that and not an outcome. It's not about now evaluating, okay, I wanted to explore, or they wanted to be better at their finishing at the rim. So it's not about now, well, I evaluate it because I was 80%. It was around the intention of what was it that was in that. For some of them, it's their chair control, or it could be ability to finish through contact. So I want to initiate contact and go finish. So they dig down into it further, and then they can say, yeah, I did. I didn't run away from that thing. That was my thing. And I went towards it, and I've committed to making myself better at that. So I had a process that I've followed. And the outcome piece, that'll show up in our gameplay and our evaluations over time. So they do that. They, as I said, can change it whenever they want, but they also have to be accountable now. We've developed it a little bit where they're accountable to each other. So we get to the board, Justin looks in, we say, Justin, how do you evaluate what you've done today? And you're like, I think I was a 6 out of 10. And then I might go, you got to be kidding me, right? Like, I thought you were incredible today, and specifically with that. And if that's not an 8, then I don't know what an 8 is. Like, you're all over it. Or they may have to, then we went to, okay, now when you give you a number, you got to quantify it. I give myself a 6 because blah, blah, blah. And they'll discuss it up front to the group. So we got to that point. Where sometimes I'll facilitate it and I'll go one by one through the group. Other times I'll small group them and they'll just report to each other and then put in the score on the board. And then sometimes I'll grab an athlete and the athlete will facilitate it. And I'll actually just stand in the background and just listen into everything that's being said. So we're trying to drive their ownership of their own progress. We're trying to make them more aware of what they're doing and how it impacts others, and what others are doing and how it impacts them. The other piece being that we're not really a team. They never play together as a team. We have a squad of 17. They're in multiple teams. There are 4 national teams, 2 junior, 2 senior, and there's a mix of athletes in there together. We also talk about how do we get wins? And we get wins by helping people achieve more with their intentions. We get wins by people getting a call up to their national team camp or making their national team, or we just sent 4 athletes to the Paralympics. Sorry, 5. So we have different ways of measuring our wins. The intentions and how they are tied together are part of that whole process. So that, again, I guess goes to your piece about it's a piece of culture building.
No doubt. And I noticed that just in the one session I was there when you brought them together, and it was this intentional debrief about intentions, which was like, okay, this could be useful. And I wanted to make sure people heard that. All right, we've been on for almost an hour, so I got one more question and I'll let you get back to your day is just starting and mine is coming to a close. We got another 2 hours of volleyball going on once we're done here. But what would you say you've most recently changed your mind on? And this is really a growth mindset question, right? We've all been dug in on certain things over time. And just as an example, I'll share that, look, I've been telling people what their roles are for 25 years, and the way in which you just framed that makes me really consider and think about, okay, this has to be co-designed. It's going to be a little bit more laborious. It's going to be longer than me just telling them, but at the end of the day, there's probably going to be better buy-in. But give me an example of something that doesn't even have to be sport related, as a new parent, let's say. But what's something that you've most recently changed your mind on?
And when I say for recently, for me, it's probably over the last 5 years, because I'm pushing out to a lot of years. It's more than 30 years, right? The last 5 years has been a real exploration for me, as I said earlier, about the learning and how do we facilitate the best possible learning environment. Goes back to a grounding in self-determination theory, in the needs of the athlete. So I really feel that my change is to become a needs-centered athlete, or athlete needs-based coach. And do they have autonomy? Do they feel a level of competence, and are they related? Do they feel a relationship to the task, their teammates, the competition, the environment, whatever it may be? And am I facilitating that? And then the next piece in around, how are we evolving? So what is the learning and how do we go about the learning, which I've already alluded to. I've been so lucky throughout my whole coaching journey, and I've always had a second place. I've always been a head coach of something and an assistant at another. And I've had, this is the tester and this is the trial, and it's all happening. And even right now, I'm about to do the second season of under 8 or under 10 basketball with my son. I'm doing the wheelchair basketball, and I've got the under 20s thing. And they're all very different, and they're affording me a chance to explore in this space around how I facilitate the needs, the basic needs of the athlete or the person, and then how do I facilitate their learning? And I'm still digging into it. I don't know if I'll ever nail it, but I'm certainly have evolved quite a bit over the last 5 years.
That's an awesome answer. I appreciate that. And I would echo that. I've coached over the last 8 years the varsity boys team and the middle school girls team at the same time. And then when my children were younger, I coached their travel softball team for 4 years while I was coaching basketball. And to your point, the testing and the trialing and the back and forth, and how do you utilize those two learning environments? I would invite anybody to put two hats on at once, even though it feels daunting. The growth curve and trajectory is much steeper. I lied. Let me end with this. Just, it's got to be a quick 60 seconds or less. What are the things that you are aware of that the Aussies do really well in teaching sport that you would like to share? And what are the areas that you feel like, say, the US model, or even when you were in the UK, that you would like to see more of there?
Yeah. If I just go Australia, US, for me, the Aussies, it's about the team. What can I do for the team? How do I help the team? And we self-manage that a bit with the tall poppy syndrome that exists in Australia. If you get a little bit too big for yourself, you get cut down really quickly by your peers. I think that can be a strength. I also think it can be a weakness, and this is where I flip to the US, in the tendency to prop the individual up, to really bring emphasis to their performance and confidence, and build the confidence. So I think we have those, and those are important things to us. I think the groups or the athletes that tend to go the first have the balance of the two. Their relationship to the bigger picture, but also that we're not cutting down their ability to stretch their boundaries as an athlete, whether it's individual sport or team sport.
No, it's a great answer. And ironically enough, the fact that you said the tall poppy syndrome, and when I was in Sydney specifically, I'm going to these schools and it's 6'9" guy. And they're like, oh yeah, everybody's got one of those. And I'm like, we don't have that. But it's funny, that's the syndrome. But yet, ironically enough, physically, we got a bunch of big dudes. Coach, has been great. I appreciate you. Looking forward to when you make it back over here and I can host you the way that you were so gracious with me.
Absolute pleasure, Justin. And yeah, no, I'm looking forward to a big day now. You've got me inspired, ready to go coach.